Welcome back to the Cultural Curriculum Chat, the show where we explore real world leadership, organizational culture, meaningful change, and how humans show up in work and in life. I'm your host, Jebeh Edmunds, and today we have a very special guest. Joining us is Ivonne Furneaux, a longtime corporate executive and founder of Empower Up Consulting, a workplace strategist, keynote speaker, and corporate survivalist who helps leaders and organizations lead through change that sticks. Yvonne spent more than 20 years inside some of the world's largest brands across industries like retail, healthcare, manufacturing, and real estate, navigating communication breakdowns, organizational chaos, and the very real human experience beneath it all. Yvonne, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have you do my introductions all the time. I'm going to bring you on the road with me, and you're just going to be my hype woman. That was an
I would
amazing intro.
love
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I would love it. You know I gotta hype each other up. Oh, I
Yes.
love this. And you are speaking my language with inclusion and really having systems that stick. And let's get into it, Yvonne, with your personal
Let's dive
journey.
in.
Yeah, you've gone through the corporate survivor per se. I love that corporate survivalist. And you talk workplace strategy and leadership with DE&I. Can you give us some examples of your experiences early in your career and what shaped you today?
Sure. Absolutely. Well, I started off my career at Target Corporation. And, I had this dream when I was in college. I went to school for journalism that I was going to become a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and travel the world, and then real life sets in. And then I went and worked in a corporate job. And I started in a corporate job at Target that wasn't even really a good fit for me. I was a business analyst trying to figure out how many orders of underwear we needed in every store, and it just wasn't the right fit. But what I knew was that I wanted to speak truth to power and be in communications in some way. And so I navigated my way internally into a communications role. And then from there, went on to work at many different companies in many different industries, as you indicated, always working in the communications realm. And then over time, started to do more employee engagement work. I was doing DEI before we even called it DEI.
That
I was
part,
starting a
yes.
diversity council, things like that. Even back in the day at Target, we were doing campaigns called like the strength of many, the power of one. We weren't calling it DEI, but that's what it was at its heart, was like valuing kind of the unique diversity of all of our employees, but understanding how we all come together to form something great. So that was some of my like early exposure to some of these concepts. And then, like I said, over time, I started doing things like running an employee resource group for women when I worked at Office Max and forming a diversity council. Then started to get more of the formal diversity training, went back to school for my master's and got a degree in strategic human resources with a focus on advancing diversity in organizations, which is a mouthful. But what it gave me was kind of this great combination of experience, right, between the communications world, starting to see employee experience in the DEI world. Eventually, I landed as a chief diversity officer at a Fortune 500 real estate company called Anywhere, which is the parent company of Coldwell Banker, Sotheby's, Better Homes and Gardens, and Century 21, among other brands. And then I leveraged all of that experience into my last corporate role at Weight Watchers, where I was a VP overseeing internal comms, DEI, social impact, and employee experience. So that was like this great culmination of everything in my career. But through all of that, I also experienced a lot of mergers, acquisitions, layoffs, reinventions, you name it. And so between all that experience, not only living through it and leading through it and surviving through it, and that's why I call myself a corporate survivalist, also got a real keen understanding of just how organizations are structured and how they operate, and the divides that we create in organizations that create a sense of belonging or a lack thereof for certain employees versus others. Some employees are in the know and some are in the dark. Some get to be in the room and some don't. And so that was really how my experience was shaped over time, which brought me to now when I'm helping organizations kind of recognize what those gaps are to help create organizations where you have more inclusion and balance and belonging.
Love that. And like you said too, like every step in your career was there for you to experience, okay, this wasn't a right fit, but I will work my way up and see. And you
Uh-huh.
did find those gaps and seeing who was included, who wasn't. And
Yep.
let's get into that with the ghost gaps. I love that term. You talk about ghost gaps, the invisible divides in workplaces that quietly sabotage engagement and trust. Can you
Yeah.
explain to us what that means and why it's such a big deal?
Sure. Yeah. So I came up with the term ghost gaps, because I just love Halloween. And so, had to get some kind of reference in there as a way to make it a little more fun. But yeah, because they're invisible and they haunt every organization, big or small. So the gaps are essentially gaps in power, gaps in information. The gaps are what determine how much access you have and how much connection you feel in an organization. And gaps are determined based on the proverbial boxes that we put people in at work. So before we can understand the boxes, we have to understand our identity at work because it's different from our identity outside of work. There's this whole layer of our identity that I call our workplace identity that only exists in the context of the workplace. And that's things like where you work, who what location you're in, if you're hourly or salaried, what team you're on, if you're a manager, how long you've been there. All of those things shape how we experience the workplace. It's why we can have two people working for the same company who have very different experiences. I'm sure Jeff Bezos and the Amazon driver have a very different experience of working at Amazon, even though their paycheck both says Amazon, right? So
Yes.
it's this idea of like our identity in the workplace that really only matters in the context of work, shapes everything about how we experience work day in and day out. In between those identities are the gaps. In between the front line and the corporate office is a gap. In between the manager and the non-manager is a gap. And that's where the ghosts kind of come to fruition, right? Those gaps in power and information. So I identified 6 specific gaps through my research. The power gap is who gets to make the decisions and who doesn't. The opportunity gap is who gets access to promotional opportunities, who gets tapped on the shoulder for projects. The investment gap is who gets invested in with training and skill building and development and time. Time is another resource that we don't invest equally in people in our organizations. The information gap is this idea of information asymmetry in the organization, I call it, where some people have access to more information, some people receive more information from their managers than others do. The visibility gap is simply who gets seen and not seen based on their position at work and their identity at work. And then there's a purpose gap, which is how close you feel to the mission of the organization. Some people feel that really connected, and some people are not. So those are 6 gaps that I've identified through my research and through my lived experience. I don't talk about the pay gap as a ghost gap because ghost gaps are invisible, and I consider the pay gap to be very, very visible.
Yes.
So I don't
Yes.
pay gap, very important, but I don't talk about it in the context of ghost gaps. So those are the 6 I identified that again have to do with access and connection. I'm sure there are more. Maybe we'll discover more through more research and lived experience. I'm sure maybe you've experienced other gaps, but at their core, again, it's just these invisible divides that we create between identities in the workplace.
I love that. And I love how each of the gaps that you did identify, we all can relate to say, "Yep, I can
Absolutely.
fit on this side or this side of the coin." And
Yeah.
and again too, and I thank you for even mentioning the pay gap as well.
Mhm.
I can hear some listeners like, "Oh, she's missing pay gap." It's like, but that's tangible. We can
It's
see
tangible.
that. And I
That's right.
love how you said that because it is tangible. We can see the data. We know it exists.
Exactly.
But like you said, it is haunting that ghost gap. Girl, you gotta trademark that ghost gap
I'm working
because
on it. I'm
I'm
working on it.
loving it. I know. As entrepreneurs, I'm like, yeah, I know you
Yes,
already have your finger on that pulse,
Yeah.
but and I really enjoyed how you even shared that we hear the opportunity gap, the misinformation, that gap too, but the noticing gap, I really, I
Visibility gap,
really
yeah.
that visibility, because that is really true. We tend to
Yeah,
again ignore that so much, and well, you're here in this corporate setting and we're doing the project. We're all team players.
that's
But
right.
that visibility is that
Mhm.
piece that I really liked how you shared that because so many of us are in that team, but
Yeah.
we know who is visible as a part of that team and who isn't.
That's
And
right. Yeah.
so,
And like you said,
yeah,
we can all relate to the gaps in some way because we've all been on one side or the other of a gap, depending on our identity in the workplace. And I also want to note that just because someone is in a perceived position of power or authority doesn't mean that they don't also experience the gaps. They just might experience some gaps more than others.
yes,
Um,
yes,
one that's interesting to me is the purpose gap, because we find that people at the lower level of an organization often feel a higher sense of purpose because they are the ones directly interacting with the customers and doing the thing that has the meaning that is the mission of the company. So the barista at Starbucks can feel a great sense of purpose because he or she is handing off the coffee that delights somebody every day, versus the person who works in HR or in finance on a spreadsheet may not feel that same sense of purpose day in and day out.
yes. Oh, that's a really great perspective to share because,
Yeah.
those folks that are those touch points right in the front line, having those relationships and the
Yeah.
connection to their clients they serve. And the other person is like, well, I don't know the mission, or I know the mission, but what part of my
Right.
purpose of this mission is keeping this organization forward? Oh,
Yeah.
this is so good, Yvonne. So, how can leaders spot these ghost gaps before they derail progress? Because you said it, they're haunting, they're silent, they're invisible. How can they spot these ghost gaps?
Well, leaders can start by asking themselves some really introspective questions and also questions about the organization, right? As a leader, who am I spending my time with the most? Who am I inviting into meetings? We all tend to, as leaders, have our own biases, proximity bias, like I'm going to talk to the person who's next to me at the office, the person who's working remotely, I might not talk to as much. Or we might just have our own personal biases of who's in and who's out based on my own personal preferences, right? So leaders have to start asking ourselves, like, who am I biasing my time toward and my energy toward? And how can I do better to balance that out in my team? More broadly in the organization, who is and isn't receiving information? What are the gaps that are keeping us from communicating with people? In a lot of organizations, there's like this sticky middle management layer where a lot of information gets stuck. So what can we do to unstick it if I'm one of those people?
Yeah.
Because, those middle managers are often the ones having to determine very real decisions every day about what's important to the people on their team because they have so many competing priorities. So it's not necessarily a blame game either. It's like trying to figure out where the priorities are and
Yes.
removing some of those barriers that we all have. So I think our responsibility as leaders really is just to, again, ask ourselves, where are we spending our time? Who's not getting information? Who hasn't been tapped for a promotion? Where can I invest time, energy, and resources more equally or equitably across my team? And then at the organizational level, asking those same questions.
I love that. That self-reflection piece is so key, because people think, okay, there are gaps, I'm noticing it, but what can I do? And you laid it very simply is that
Yeah.
introspection, the time bias, the proximity bias.
Mhm.
There's so many things that you can tweak and change. And yes, the middle managers, like, the messy middle, like they deal with, those
Yeah,
decisions, the priorities like you pointed out, and also they get the pushback. They are the first ones to
that's right.
get, the response, and those people in upper leadership don't get it. They're the first ones to feel it. So,
Yeah.
cluing them in that communication, like you said, is so important. And speaking of, communication and trust, that we get a lot of that, in that corporate setting and other organizations. Is there any tips, that communication, that we could use to continue to build that trust in that real engagement out
Yeah.
there? Mhm.
Sure. So I use not to bring in like academic stuff, but I use a framework
Yeah.
called the 4I framework. And it's inform, involve, inspire, and invest. And it's a formula that organizations can use to start to narrow the ghost gaps. Inform is all about narrowing those information gaps and battling information asymmetry. Inspire is all about creating that sense of purpose for folks and connecting people to a mission, vision, and values that are meaningful for the future for them. Invest is all about investing our time, energy, and resources into folks. And involve is that inclusion piece. And how do we include more people? So specifically thinking about the inform bucket of that framework, there are a lot of things we can do to narrow the information gaps through communication. One of the things we can start to do that I find is the most challenging for leaders is communicating better in the midst of uncertainty. I think we know that there's always a lot of chaos happening at organizations. There's a lot of change happening, stuff I told you I've lived through time and time again. So there's this tendency sometimes from leaders to withhold information. And the best way to close the information gap is by being transparent with your communication. That is the best thing you can do to build trust, and trust builds engagement. It's a very simple continuum that transparency breeds trust and trust breeds engagement. So, to be transparent, even in the midst of chaos, you can think about communicating even when you don't have all the answers, because that's the trouble that leaders feel sometimes. Like, how can I communicate something when I don't have all the answers yet? I don't have all my I's dotted and T's crossed. And that's okay, because you
Mhm.
can still bring people along even when you don't have all the answers yet. So you can think about communicating, what is it that we know for sure is going to happen? What do we know for sure is not going to happen? What are we still trying to figure out and we'll get back to you on as soon as we can? Literally communicating those basic things will help bring people along and build trust. So that, to me, the transparency piece of the information formula is key to, making strides and narrowing those gaps.
I love that. And again, with that distrust is the lack of
That's
transparency.
right.
And people hit the panic button. They're looking on, Indeed, not sponsored, but just like, okay, well, I might see the writing on the wall, but there's nothing to write on,
Right, right.
but
Yeah,
just say, those simple things of what we do know, what we don't know, what we will let you know when it does come. So,
that's right.
that's so important. And you're right. When it is chaos in times of conflict. That's when everything is heightened. And I feel
Yes.
too, as organization, they might say like, "Oh, we're giving them too much information." I rather have too much than not enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Especially learning from our time during COVID, like, give me
Yes.
as much as you have, and we can decipher what is too much and what, but at least you
Yeah.
can tell me, so I can figure out what I need to do with my team.
Yeah, and like you said, in
Yeah.
the absence of information, people will create their own stories,
Yes,
or
yes.
when they have part of a story. I've done it myself, right? There's layoffs
Yeah,
in another
human
team,
nature.
and I'm
Yes.
convinced now that the company's going bankrupt and I'm gonna be fired tomorrow. Like, we just create
Yeah.
our own narratives in the absence of
Yeah.
that information.
Yes, and that also creates more chaos within ourselves, and again, yeah, that retention is just very fickle. Oh,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know, I know.
Have you seen the show The Traitors on Peacock? It's
I haven't, but it's all over my commercials. I'm like, "I need to get into this
You need to get into it.
show."
It started in the UK and now there's a US
Yeah,
version. I bring it up and I actually talk about it in my talks sometimes because
yeah.
the premise of the show is that there's all these people put together in a castle in Scotland, and 3 of them are secretly deemed traitors at the beginning of the show, but they're pretending to be what are called faithfuls. And it's the job of the faithfuls to suss out who the traitors are. But of course, the traitors are
Okay.
lying the entire time, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
every night they're murdering somebody, not
Yeah,
literally
yeah.
murdering them, but
Yeah, yeah,
pretend murdering them.
yeah.
And so every day somebody's getting knocked off, and the faithfuls are still trying to figure out who the traitors
The
are, right?
traders are
What happens is it's the same thing that happens inside the walls of an organization. In the absence
yes.
of information, you don't know who to trust. Everybody
Mhm.
becomes an enemy, even when you're supposed to be working together as a team. You are creating stories in your mind. Like, they will take the simplest thing, like somebody misspoke or somebody held their fork wrong or dropped their spoon at the wrong time, and now they're convinced that they're a traitor because they don't know otherwise. So
Yeah.
I tell people to watch it because it's kind of like this real life or reality TV example of what happens in organizations when people don't trust each other and there's a lack of information to
Yes.
share.
Yeah, and again, that human nature of
Yes.
coming up with your own narrative for your own survival,
Yes.
right? Like, "Oh, they're looking at me funny," or "They said the wrong thing," or, they're trying to decipher as they go along with this
Yes.
game, and
Yep.
then the people that they suspect is the traitor, is gone,
Yeah,
killed off per
exactly.
se, and then they're like, "Well, now that is up in the air again." Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
I gotta
It's
you
a
got me
I
convinced,
will tell you
Yvonne.
too,
Okay.
there's a whole other level of study
Yeah.
of that show around, race and gender bias because
Yes.
there is a tendency for people of color to be tapped as traitors earlier
Yeah.
on. So
Yeah.
it's like this really interesting study in human nature and
Yeah.
bias.
Yep, and that you nailed it, that implicit bias of,
Yep.
well, they are this person of this underserved group, so therefore, because of the bias that was ingrained in me, they must be the traitor. Oh, I know that
Exactly.
they must be,
Yep.
Oh, that's a whole nother episode, but
It's a whole other
yes,
episode, yes.
I can't we'll have to have you back on about that too. Oh my
Yes.
goodness. So yes, so talking about, let's shift some gears, in
Yeah,
your
let's
work
do
and
it.
emphasizing because I really love how you want us to move from mentorship to sponsorship, for
Right.
meaningful advancement. Because, of course, in the corporate ladder, we have that proximity bias and it's all in who you know, Jeb. And, I know this person because I went to high school with this and they got the internship. So I'm going to
Yep.
mentor them. Or, oh, I don't know about you. Again, those stories.
Mhm.
We need to move on from that mentorship to sponsorship. So
Mhm.
explain to us, Yvonne, why is sponsorship, such a game changer?
Yeah.
Just changing that mindset of getting people into your realm and your space for advancement.
Yeah, so I wanna connect this too back to what we were talking about earlier with the framework because
Yes.
having a sponsor or a mentor falls into that invest bucket. Because I
Yes.
wanna make it clear that the framework isn't just for leaders and organizations, it's for you navigating the organization because there are things that you can do to invest in yourself to advance your career or to help you navigate this complicated space in the workplace, right? So, invest, remember, is about investing time, energy, and resources. So, when I think about investing in myself and how I want to advance my career, my first thought may be maybe I could use a mentor who's going to give me some great advice. And I will tell you right now that women in particular and people of color are over mentored and under sponsored. We can have
Yes.
mentors up the wazoo who give us advice, but nothing changes until you have a person who will speak your name when you are not in the room. That is the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. A sponsor is going to sing your praises. They're going to wear your t-shirt, carry your water, whatever analogy you want to use.
Yes.
They are going to be the person that helps you get ahead, that helps lift you in the organization, or who helps get you on a project, or even gets you seen. The sponsor is the person who helps you overcome the visibility gap.
Yes.
So that is a game changer for your career if you choose that that's what you will want for advancement. But in order to find that sponsor, you have to build relationships. You have to make yourself seen. You have to raise your hand for projects, right? Um, and I always talk about LeBron James. We all know who LeBron James is,
Oh
right?
yeah.
So he grew up with a group of friends when he was a kid, and as he got older, rather than just giving them money, he invested in their education and their businesses to help them become accomplished on their own. So I think of that as also the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. It's like this partnership arrangement where you're lifting each other up together because
Yes.
how you act is also a reflection on the person who sponsors you. So you have to build that relationship of trust because you're making them also look good or bad. And they're not doing it solely out of altruism. They are also doing it to help themselves, right? So, the difference then between being a mentor and a sponsor again is all about the investment of time and being able to speak about somebody when they're not in the room and singing their praises. Um, and that goes, again, both ways as the person being sponsored, but I would also encourage people to be sponsors for others. No matter what level of an organization you're in, the chances are you are in a room that somebody else does not get to be in. So you
Yes.
also can take it as a responsibility to sing the praises of others who don't get to be in the room like you do.
Yes, and I love how that sponsorship you're sponsoring someone, that person that you're sponsoring is like, wow, they're in that room, they're in that space. I have to show that, yeah, they're endorsing me. I got to show them
You
that
gotta
I'm
show
worth
up.
being endorsing, you know? So
That's
it
right.
is that give together, that partnership, you know, to say, I
Yeah.
believe in you enough. I'm going to keep saying your name in spaces that you're not invited to. But, you know, you got to also show me that, hey, I can back up what I'm saying too, you know,
Yeah.
about you. So
Yeah.
that I love that LeBron James example. Thank you for sharing that. That,
Yeah.
yeah, I believe in you so much, but I wanna lift each other up as we go,
That's right.
because that is just
That's right.
amazing.
Not making the
Yeah.
same mistake of, like, MC Hammer who just, like, gave away all his
I
money to people, and all the
know,
money's gone,
right?
right?
And it's gone.
The money is
Yes,
gone. Got
yes.
nothing for it.
Nothing, nothing to show for it, I know. And so I just one more rapid fire question before
Sure.
I want people to learn more about you and your
Yeah.
work. What is the biggest myth about workplace culture that you wanna bust, like, right now?
The biggest myth about workplace culture is that HR owns it and that HR shapes it. That is the biggest myth. Culture just is. Culture exists. It is it is in the water, in the air of any organization, and it exists by virtue of the decisions that people make and the behavior that they demonstrate. So the only way you change culture is to change behavior. You don't change culture by putting new posters on the wall or writing new words that you put on a poster. Like that is not culture. Culture is not pizza parties and perks and ping pong tables. It is about like how people behave day in and day out in an organization. I had an old boss who used to say that culture is who you hire, who you fire, and who you promote. And to me, that says everything because it's about what you value. It's about the behavior that is rewarded or not rewarded. And that is culture. So the myth is that culture is all the fun stuff, or the posters, or that HR owns it. It's none of that. It's the day in and day out lived experience that just exists in an organization.
Love that, Yvonne. Thank you.
Yeah.
Because it is so true. It's not just, oh, it's this, heritage background month, so we gotta change the posters and do this and it's like, no, it's more than that. And I
Yeah.
love that it encapsulates, yeah, who you hire, who you fire, who
Yeah.
you promote.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's deep.
I
Yeah,
mean,
because
I
that
used to work
is.
somewhere where we talked about the culture being fast, fun, and friendly. Those were the posters on the wall, fast, fun, and
Mhm,
friendly. And
mhm.
I will tell you, it was fast, but it was not fun or friendly. So,
That part. And you're just thinking like, I know some folks in here be like, "Mm-mm, only one out of those 3 Fs, and that's not a
right.
good rating," you
That's
know?
right.
You have to have it for all 3, yes. Oh, Yvonne, this is so fun hanging out with you. Where can we
You.
find you? Learn more about your
Yeah.
Empower Up Consulting? Yes, tell us where we can continue your journey with
Yeah.
you.
Well, you
Yes.
can connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me by my name, Ivonne Furneaux. You can visit my website, yvonnefurneaux.com. If you're more interested in consulting, you can do empowerupconsulting.com. You can find me on YouTube at Yvonne Furneaux, and you can find me on Instagram at Yvonne in real life.
Love that, and I'll have all of that in our
Yes.
show notes, everyone. And, oh, Yvonne, this has just been an incredible conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your
Yeah.
4 eyes, your 6 ghost gap pillars. And I love all of that you're doing, and thank you so much for continuing to recognize that with our organizations and helping us all along the way to translate some of the things where we still feel stuck even in
Yeah.
2026, but to know that there's hope and there's simple tweaks that we can do along the way, to keep moving forward.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. And if you have listeners who are DEI practitioners who are really struggling with how to move forward in this very crazy
yes.
time right now when DEI is under
Yeah.
attack, I would encourage them to go back and think about that workplace identity concept we talked about, because
Yes.
workplace identity is kind of a neutral way to talk about organizational fairness or not, right? Where we remove some of the race, gender, and other things that are a little more tricky to talk about right now, and we strictly talk about like, where's the organization creating disparities based on who people know or where people sit? And I'll tell you, chances are when you start to examine that, you will see a lot of intersectionality with the other things that we care about. So when you
Yes.
start to invest in your frontline workforce, you're going to make strides in those other spaces. So that's a way that I would encourage folks to go forward in this time. If you take nothing else from this and you're figuring out, how do I go from here? But thank you so much again for having me and letting me talk about some of these crazy concepts that I've been researching and sharing.
I love it. My pleasure. You've been such a delight.
Thank
And, thank you, listeners, viewers. Be sure to share this episode with someone who is wondering, what am I missing? It could be that ghost gap that they just don't know how to decipher. And again, thank you all for listening to the Cultural Curriculum Chat podcast and viewing on Mrs. Edmunds' Cultural Corner. I will see you here, same time next week. Bye bye.